Hey, Data Skeptic listeners, TLDR, the last few episodes in the feed are part of our pilot season. We're trying out some new themes for the show. They're all aired, so we're asking you guys to vote. Our poll is going to stay open one more week. Please head over to dataskeptic.com/vote. And thank you very much to Juan Carlos, who was the first person to let me know that link was not working initially. Apologies for early voters. We're a small shop. I didn't realize you had to change the sharing on Google Forms, but that's all sorted now. Polls will run one more week. Go and get your vote in. While we do the tabulation and line up our first set of guests, I'm going to air a few special episodes here like this one. Today's format almost made it into pilot season, but I like the idea so much I decided we're just going to do this from time to time. This episode is titled, They're Coming for Our Jobs, and it's all about AI and automation. So again, go vote, dataskeptic.com/vote. I've been criticized a bit for things I've said in talks or maybe on this podcast about automation. These are things of a skeptical nature, as you might expect, and they're things I stand by. As far as the threat of automation, I remain unconvinced. There are many people, some high-profile people, who will forward the idea that mass unemployment lies in humanity's future as jobs are automated away. I sure hope not. But as a skeptic who is fully aware that the future is hard to predict, I think the burden of proof really lies on the claimant. Although in some sense, they're not directionally wrong. Automation is coming. It's going to keep happening. It would be alarming if it didn't, right? Maybe the question is, will the rate of automation accelerate? I'm not sure, but again, burden of proof on the claimant. I guess you could point to Moore's Law, but Moore's Law wasn't disruptive in a bad way, so I don't know if that's a good example for the point. So maybe the real important question is, how disruptive will AI-based automation be to the world in the future? I don't have the answer. In the discussion of automation and joblessness, the second most common occupation that people bring up is elevator operators. And I assume their arguments are rather obvious, I don't need to go into them here. And I also assume no one is in favor of requiring tall buildings to maintain human operators. So it would seem we're probably all in agreement that automation will happen and jobs will disappear. Or really evolve, but that's beside the point. We can stick with disappear. I think the important concern is how disruptive will these things be? And depending on one's perspective, the government should be involved in cushioning these events. If and how that's done is a matter I encourage everyone to think deeply about and come to their own decisions on. Now, if elevator operators are the second most brought up occupation, have you guessed the first? Correct. Uber drivers. Whenever I talk about automation with someone and they bring up Uber drivers, the first thing I ask is, how long have you been driving for Uber for? And the typical answer is, I've never driven for Uber. Yet somehow those people tell me they know what Uber drivers are thinking. If you know what someone is thinking, that's a psychic power. I don't believe in psychic powers. So I thought it would be interesting to occasionally check in with people from a variety of occupations and take an informal, anecdotal census of one of how people in specific professions think about the threat of automation to that profession. Today on the show, no, not an Uber driver. I need to do a lot more background research and studying before I can confidently poke that hornet's nest. Today, I speak with Celestia Ward. I first got to know her listening to the Squaring the Strange podcast, where she's a co-host. In addition to the glamorous life of a podcaster, she is also a professional editor and caricature artist. So this is a twofer, as those are the professions we're going to get into her perspectives on. To what degree will AI and automation affect those roles? And for better or for worse?
Hi, I'm Celestia Ward. I'm one of the co-hosts of the Squaring the Strange podcast, where we look into all sorts of interesting mysteries or strange phenomenon and try to take a skeptical, critical eye to it, even mundane things like heuristics and ways that our senses fool us. And by profession, I am a longtime cartoonist and caricature artist. I'm also an academic editor, and I work in PR and I edit lots of people's text.
Yeah, I first got to know you being a longtime listener to Squaring the Strange, and great to have a two-way conversation instead of the one-way I'm used to having. But I, learned from all the episodes about a lot of the services you've done, to mention the two, caricature work and academic editing, that made you stand out as a great guest for a new segment I'm trying to get started, building up topics around automation. And since we cover AI so much, I want to make sure that we're at least asking good questions about, is AI a threat to work and economic security and stuff like that? Maybe too soon, or maybe never too soon to ask questions like that. And rather than I guess what different people think, and it's always dangerous to assume you know what someone else is thinking, why not touch base with people in various professions and see, what is the threat, if any, of automation? So that's our broad setup.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to get into the discussion. I learned a bit just in terms of thinking about something that's sort of in the background of your everyday job, day to day, but you don't really take the time to distill it down and sort of look back as to, okay, how has this evolved? You mentioned that you've used the old-timey program Xywrite to edit books, and that was the first one that I learned on back in like 1994.
Awesome. Yeah, I've had I was sort of born at a time where it's almost like lucky in a way that I saw technology develop so fast. So I know some of these kind of relics, but there were some really good tools very early on.
Yeah, that was the first tool I was sort of the same era where I used Xywrite for a couple of years, and then we, segued to Word and started using other things. But it's like, oh, we can use macros. We can do XYZ to an entire 500-page manuscript and save that much time for the editor or, whoever is shepherding the book through production. And with all of AI, there's that question of tools versus harm versus something pointless because it will never be able to do it as well as a human mind, or will it? So, there's a lot to consider.
Well, in the editing world, there was a day when every draft was a new copyright, a new retype, and computers provided automation. Is anyone bitter about that specific innovation?
Well, back in the day when I worked at a university press, most of my colleagues were, women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And there was a little bit of a Luddite tendency to be like, oh, I really prefer paper edit. And we won't even need to use, proofreaders' marks, and people don't know them anymore. And the computer's doing stuff I don't expect. So there's, of course, always to be expected. People who've been used to doing something a certain way are going to be a little resistant to the new ways. But one thing I thought about with AI, and then reading through some of the deep neural network bits of writing made me think, a lot of editors might actually appreciate just getting text that was generated by an AI to look it over, because the human being hand-holding part of book editing is a really big job. Having to explain to the author what a grammatical rule is and why you have to follow it and why you can't put commas wherever you please. An AI won't take umbrage to any of that. So yeah, that was one little thing I thought about. I did reach out to some of the longtime, full-time editors that I know, and their thoughts were pretty uniform. They don't feel like AI is going to threaten their job anytime soon. They all kind of appreciated the evolution of, your basic spell check and Clippy the paperclip to what we have now. Most people use Word, and it's no longer called spell check, it's called spelling and grammar check. And it does catch a lot. It catches a lot, but it also catches a lot of things that aren't errors. So you'll have these annoying little, lines in there that are like, no, that doesn't really reflect a real error. That's a stylistic choice. That's just something the AI doesn't understand. So you need a human being to make that determination. Some of the editor friends I reached out to said that standards for proofreading have kind of been falling for decades, especially with online content that just goes out pretty instantly. But people conflate proofreading with editing, and they're not the same. Editing involves organizing, looking at the tone, subtle word choices, consistency, clarity, precision, and proofreading is just making sure, is there a typo in this? Does page 2 follow page 1? And editing is far more involved than that. As I mentioned, there's the human-to-human work. You are often the liaison to the author. You're helping somebody who perhaps has never published a book before go through the production cycle and telling them what they need to do for each stage of it. You're gathering permissions. You're looking for redundancies. And in the newspaper business, editors are on the phone calling reporters, telling them to go places and dig deeper for certain stories, or they might make a judgment call on which stories to shelve because there's already been a couple stories similar to it that week. There's a lot involved that I don't see AI taking the reins on. A quote I'd like to mention from a colleague is she said, "Data-assisted journalism is transformative, but data and AI can't go it alone."
Oh, I think that's a great quote. Proofreading, as you were pointing out, things like spelling, if that's your only service, yeah, you're going to be in trouble. But when you draw more broadly the editing process, there does seem to be a lot to it. In fact, I'm kind of impressed that, I guess my question is, how do you do that with, someone who might be writing a PhD level book in a subject that you might not be trained in? That's got to be extra challenging as an editor. How do you work in that environment?
Well, I just did that recently. I've edited a couple of dissertations in fields that I'm obviously not a PhD in. You understand that your job is to make the text readable to somebody who might not be a PhD in that subject, or at least not know about the specific thing that dissertation is about. If the dissertation is doing what it's supposed to, it will be presenting some original work. So that has to be understandable. And you try to make it understandable to a person not in the field. And anything you're unclear on, you just query the author. And if there's some technical terminology that does not need to be explained further than it is, then the author will tell you.
And I ask this because I think we do have a lot of academic types listening who maybe haven't yet had such a collaboration. Are there ways they could best prepare to get the most efficient use out of the collaboration?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that anybody prepares to be edited. I would say really one of the biggest roadblocks to getting a good edit is thinking everything you've written is precious. People start treating every paragraph like it's a child. And sometimes you need to cut things. Sometimes you need to recast things. And also make sure you have the right editor. The right editor will keep your tone, keep it in your voice, make it sound like you, just more correct.
There is some work. I'm not going to say it's convincing work, but it's impressive that they're doing this in natural language processing where they can actually change the tone but keep the facts of things right. Early work, they were able to change tenses, and they got that pretty quick. But now, they'll take this, it's called style transfer, rewrite this poem in the style of Dostoevsky or something along those lines. And I'm not academic enough about literature to judge the quality, but they're being taken somewhat seriously in the literature.
Yeah, I was reading a little bit into those, and I've seen some examples. It's hard for me to see it as anything but a neat little parlor trick right now. Like, I could imagine a bunch of Twitter feeds pretending to be long dead authors or philosophers, tweeting about current events in the style of that long dead author or philosopher, and that might be fun and interesting. But I think you do still need human eyes to look things over, and certainly in the case of a well-loved author, you want somebody who's a scholar of that author to, I'm quite sure they could write a list of things the AI got wrong. But as it goes, I'd be curious to see how that evolves, because one of the types of AIs that's been making waves for a while is, I'm not even sure what the name of this program is, or this algorithm, but it can go through a huge amount of text and, for instance, the Bible, and say, okay, this part of the Bible was likely written by different authors than that part of the Bible based on 12 different factors that differ from section to section. I mean, that could be used by teachers to weed out. There actually already are many programs that teachers use to weed out plagiarism.
It's interesting. There's a lot of movement in that direction. Historically, they've looked at stylometric features like word choices and distribution of word content. And I know a lot of the neural network stuff has gotten higher accuracies on that work. So yeah, I guess more tools are available. Perhaps the Clippy was a misstep. It doesn't always have the best reputation. But despite that, it seems like things are coming around. I guess, would it be fair to say that, at least from your point of view, there's not a lot of threat to the actual core of what's delivered there, but these tools might be in your tool belt in the future?
I really do think you can see them as tools. Everything is a double-edged sword. Another thing I heard from people in the field, friends of mine, because I haven't done every type of editorial or writing job around, so I have friends who have other experiences that I can draw on when answering big questions like this. She said, the Associated Press has used some AI to write some simple news stories already, but reporters aren't losing jobs because of this. They're not losing jobs to AI. They're losing jobs to hedge funds who buy up newspapers and then gut everything. And that's way more of a threat to your average newspaper editor or reporter than AI ever will be. In fact, you can really look at it as a way for a newspaper to survive. Rather than hire some reporters to cover really basic stories, if you could churn those stories out without having to use the manpower, then you could keep your newspaper running on a smaller staff and survive.
That's a fair concern, actually. One of the great examples that's out there is sports scores. So like the results of like a horse race. Those have been automated, or at least a great deal of them have. And I guess maybe that was someone's job that they lost. And if so, I hope they landed on their feet, of course. It's hard to say. I know that's been changing for a while. Do you have a sense it might be accelerating?
Yeah, well, see, the whole idea of losing jobs to The old John Henry story of, I can't dig the tunnel through the coal mountain fast enough, so this machine is going to take my job. There's so many different confounding factors involved in what keeps a publisher viable, what keeps a newspaper running. And AI is not what editors are worried about right now. One editor I know who works in medical textbooks says that the first round of copy editing for some of the projects she works with is done by AI, and you still need a human being to look things over. It's not like the editor loses their job. They just might be able to do more books a week. And we as human beings are publishing way more books than we ever used to. And with online content, there's that much more. There's another aspect to that, the amount of content online, and I'll get into that later. The main thing that's putting academic editors, and again, the STEM books that my friend works in, she said a lot of the editing has gone out to people in India. So people in Southeast Asia and India who know English enough to edit the book. She said that unfortunately means the American editors lose their jobs because of, the outsourcing. And the editors in India took several years to learn how to do the technical editing, and they still perform at a significantly lower level than the American editors, which is understandable. I mean, as a native English speaker, I would never be able to edit something highly technical in Hindi. Even if I got trained for a decade, I could not do that. So the economic forces do sometimes mean the job will get done by another human being who perhaps does not have the right background or training to do the most perfect job, but it's passable and it's cheaper.
Makes sense. And yeah, if that's what the economic demands are, that's typically the way a company goes. Well, there's one score I asked you to take a quick look at, a somewhat simple one, because we covered it recently on the show. It's the Kincaid Readability score. To remind listeners, if they didn't catch the other episode, it's kind of a way of trying to estimate the appropriate grade level or how easy it is to read something. Broadly speaking, was this something you were aware of or have a general reaction to when you first encountered it?
I've heard of it before. It's not something I use in my, everyday writing. A lot of editors just sort of, it's not like we run our projects through some sort of algorithm to find out what the grade level is. You have a sense sort of instinctually of this is for general, this is for the landing page of a website. I'm not going to have words that are 5 syllables long on here. You understand what tone and audience it's supposed to give off here. Reading through the way that it's calculated, the way that the Kincaid grade level is calculated, reminded me sort of BMI, the body mass index. Yeah, is it perfect for absolutely every specific thing? No. But as a general whole population gauge, it's quite useful. I think it has its uses, but as an editor, I don't see what
We built you a boondoggle. Yet another tool an engineer created that is not necessarily of use to the target audience.
And as you pointed out in one of your earlier episodes, it can certainly come out with wildly incorrect grade level scores. I mean, I remember reading Jabberwocky in 7th grade, and I'd be curious to know what you'd get if you plugged Jabberwocky into the Kincaid grade level algorithm.
All right, for reference, the flesh reading ease of Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky poem is 47.42, and the Kincaid grade level is 12.5, or the equivalent of a U.S. high school senior, roughly the age of 18.
Yeah, but just like the macros that we used in Xywrite, it's a helpful thing if you need to get some sort of idea or make some sort of changes on something that's 500 pages long with the push of a button. That's fantastic to have in your arsenal.
With that in mind, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what engineers could actually do that would be helpful or empowering for editors. There's lots of boondoggles being written and built all the time. Maybe that's what it takes, right? It's a learning process and you eventually come up with good products. But rather than people like machine learning people and data scientists assuming they know what you need and trying to automate that away, are there any gaps or areas you see of opportunity where technology could help you and allow you to scale up and that sort of thing?
Oh, what would be fantastic is if you could, as an editor, if you could adjust your grammar checker to follow either Chicago Manual of Style or AP or some other form of style book. And I'm sure there's ways you could dig into the guts of it yourself and customize it. But I've never invested the hours to learn how to do that. I just do it by eye. So it is aggravating to have things flagged that, no, that's correct in the style guide that I'm using. So you just ignore the little suggestion to change it and you keep going. And you end up having to ignore stuff like that over the course of, again, 500 pages. So being able to customize something, being able to just say, okay, I'm going to be using the Oxford comma in this project. So click, tell me when it looks like I'm missing an Oxford comma. That would be helpful. Or I'm not using the Oxford comma. Please don't ever tell me I need an Oxford comma, because there's different guidebooks and different ways you do different projects. And the idea, any editor will tell you, the idea is not to be perfect. And the idea is to be consistent in that one piece.
Well, I happen to agree. I think you're very safe in this service, provided that it's a machine that could do an editor's job, could also probably pass the Turing test, which means we're going to have a very different discussion anyways. The most shining thing we've got, I guess, is some of the results from GPT-3. I think I may have sent you a link to the famous unicorn scientific paper.
Yes, I read through some of those, and I also did a bit of reading on GPT-3, which I'm going to read to you a text that I thought was really interesting from Andrzej Karpathy. He said, by posting GPT-generated text, we're polluting the data for its future versions, meaning like a game of telephone, if the AI is scraping the internet for examples of what human language is like, if it keeps finding examples that have been written by AI, it's going to evolve on its own like that, rather than clinging to the human language. And I mean, that's how language evolves, though. I mean, we all, as human beings who speak and read, we are all learning from each other constantly. And if the AI is what is producing the language, then the AI is going to also learn from the AI. And that's an interesting thought experiment down the road.
For sure. And he's a famous guy who would know.
The one thing I have noticed, because there is AI-generated text out there, in the job that I work as a PR coordinator these days, there's a lot of content that has been sort of spewed out by oftentimes foreign outlets or just bots. You don't even know if it's a real human being at the helm of this outlet that, claim to be magazines. There's some very interesting quote unquote publications that are floating around in the net, and they aren't what they appear to be. They publish, quote unquote, publish anything and everything. And their business model is just kind of to put out a fishing line and offer every business out there, every entrepreneur, every PR agency, a pay for play opportunity to get your story in an online magazine that really is not so much an online magazine as it's sort of a PR version of catfishing. It gathers content through automatic submission portals, so you're not even really working with a human being. They collect a fee, and then the bot, or wherever the operation is from, scrapes content from other online sources to make the magazine website look like a real publication when it's actually not. That's an interesting sort of a scam business model that's been happening. And if you're in the business, you sort of look for that. Part of your job is to be able to steer your clients away and say, no, I realize you want to get in Super Duper Entrepreneur Monthly, but that's not a real publication. So that is, unfortunately, AI and bots, automation can get used for some...
It's like digital pollution.
Very much like digital pollution, but there's a scam undertone to it. They want you to pay your $200 fee to get into their top 10 list, or to be given a online digital award in some magazine. And so again, creating jobs for editors and PR professionals is becoming familiar with this and being able to spot, oh, wait, the entire quote unquote letter from the editor in the front of this magazine sounds like it was written by a bot. This is not a real magazine.
And it just sprang into existence 6 weeks ago, and it went from no publications to 4 a day somehow. And
yeah, so when you are reaching out to get some sort of press release out and you hear back instantly, like within 30 seconds, with an email from one of these publications that has made it onto the PR database, and, it's something generic like, hello, friend, we would love to publish your story. Automatically, you're like, okay, this is generated by AI. This is a bot.
Thanks to this week's sponsor, Blinkist. Let me tell you about my secret weapon for learning new things and getting ahead. It's hard to find the time to sit down and read and learn more. When you don't have free time, you can't read or work on personal development. There's an incredible app that solves this problem, and I highly recommend it. It's called Blinkist. Blinkist has taken thousands of nonfiction books and condensed them down to just 15 minutes that you can read or listen to. It's nonfiction, so it's not like there's spoilers here. I love Blinkist because there's just too much coming out. It's hard to keep up and know what I want to read or be involved with. Sometimes all I want is a summary. For example, someone recommended The Barefoot Investor to me by Scott Pape. I'm not sure if it's what I want to read, so I'm going to check out the Blinkist summary first. Oh, and here's an interesting one. The Janus Point, A New Theory of Time by Julian Barbour. Right up my alley. But I want to check out the Blinkist condensed version before I make a commitment. With Blinkist, you get unlimited access to read or listen to a massive library of condensed nonfiction books, all of the books you want, and all for one low price. Right now, for a limited time, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/dataskeptic. That's Blinkist. You can try it free for 7 days and save 25% off your new subscription. That's Blinkist, Blinkist.com/dataskeptic to start your 7-day free trial. And, it's interesting, I could blame a lot of this on algorithms. For a while, this scam kind of died off. And maybe you guys got this too, but there was a period of time where the podcast, Data Skeptic, was constantly winning awards. Awards I'd never heard of, awards I hadn't applied for. And while I'm very flattered, what I kind of figured out was everything about the award was, now put this logo on your website and link to our site where it announces you were an award. It was kind of like an SEO scam of saying, let's just try and get inbound links from podcasts.
Oh, yes, there are plenty of those out there in the PR world where they don't necessarily focus on curating a good small bit of content that they turn into a magazine. They publish thousands of things every day. You just send it to the portal and it gets published. But is it worthwhile? Is it worth your effort? Probably not. They're just trying to scrape for clicks and likes and visibility and anything that will generate. I suppose that kind of harkens back to the old adage that the people who are quickest to adopt new technology tend to be criminals and pornographers. So there's definitely scams to watch out for. And people, that's part of your skeptical toolbox, your consumer, your caveat emptor, you keep your consumer wits about you. People are getting more educated on how to spot, this is a bot. This is not real. And it takes a while sometimes. I've had emails back and forth before I realized this is not, I've done some more research and every single good review about this publication is signed, Eric Adamson or Roger Jameson. And I'm like, these are like what people think American names are. They're not actually. They're generated.
Yeah, that's going to get harder and harder to tell. So we absolutely need to bulk up our skeptical toolboxes for that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it is an arms race.
Well, I think you can feel safe then on your services as an editor being around, at least until we have an artificial general intelligence who maybe, I guess, can compete with you. But let's maybe switch gears or switch hats and talk a little bit about your life as an artist. I know your work specifically as a caricature artist. What is caricature art that distinguishes it from other types of art?
I'm glad you asked. There's a pretty good quote by the caricature artist John Casht, who said, "A caricature is a portrait with the volume turned up."
I like it, yeah.
And if you're a working caricature artist, if you're in the chair, drawing people where, at a tourist trap or a bar mitzvah or, live, you hear people, oh, you really captured his essence, or, oh, you boiled her down to just her essence. And that word is used a lot. And because caricature is really kind of boiling something down to the bits of data that hit our perception hardest, it's not shaving away the important stuff. It's shaving away all the unimportant stuff and leaving the bits that you can see that really hit you as, oh, that really looks like so-and-so. It can get very close to abstract art. And one of the neural network things that has actually come up in caricature conventions I've been to, I mean, not many scientific papers are presented at caricature conventions, but there was an experiment that somebody went over and everybody was very riveted by it. Something called a supernormal stimulus. Have you heard of that?
I have not.
The idea is it's something that's sort of perverted. And I mean perverted like in terms of warped or exaggerated or twisted beyond its usual state. Can sometimes be more pleasing or at least more exciting to the viewer. And we observe this in human beings when it comes to, say, pornography or advertisements or caricatures. And the term supernormal stimulus comes from a researcher named Nico Tinbergen. He's an ornithologist, I believe. He worked with birds and he elicited all sorts of responses to these supernormal stimuli. For instance, a bird would see an egg outside of its nest and the instinct would be to push the egg back into its nest. And if the egg was larger, this response would be much greater than if it was a smaller egg. And baby birds pecking at their mother's beak for food, if the beak had like a little red mark at the end of the beak, they would see the red mark and they would get excited. But if you put in a stick with 2 red marks on it, they would get even more excited and peck even harder for more food. So yeah, you take a stimulus and you change it. You're making it larger or smaller, or you're exaggerating it in some way, and it actually creates a bigger response in the viewer, be it baby birds or human beings. And as a caricature artist, that's what you're trying to do. And the brain is a tricky thing, and perception is a tricky thing. And when I looked at the images that were produced by the deep neural networks, they were labeled strawberry or bagel or traffic light. And I looked at them and I was like, this is fascinating. And I'm amazed that things have come this far. I don't see them as failures. Some of the reading you'll see on the deep neural networks are like, okay, these art programs or these AI programs that are supposed to be creating art, they're really not recognizable as the object. And I disagree with that. I think it's trying to boil it down to the essence. And I'm very excited by seeing that. I mean, should it strike fear into me or all caricature artists that we're going to be replaced by AI? No, I think more likely it kind of interests me to get a stack of these deep neural network images and study them as an exercise in abstraction, as a way to sort of get into the zen of exaggerating something and minimalizing things before I try to do that to a human face or something else.
Something that's always impressed me about caricature work is that the output is not supposed to be photorealistic, at least not to my understanding. It's deliberately cartoonish, yet somehow you could show me caricature work, and if it's a person I know, I'll know who it is instantly, as if it were a photograph.
If it's a good caricature, yes. There's a broad spectrum of work that passes for caricature. And so, again, at the top level, I go to the ISCA, the International Society of Caricature Artists. I attend the convention like every year, and I give presentations there sometimes. And the work you see on the wall is going to be very abstracted. It's going to remind you of some of the deep neural network images that you saw. It doesn't look human. It doesn't look like anything to the average viewer sometimes. But the caricature artists, the divergent thinkers in there that have decided to make their life around this peculiar form of art, they'll look at that weird design and they'll be like, oh yeah, that's Eric. That's totally Eric. I see Eric in there.
And we could test it, right? We could segregate those people and do some sort of double-blind experiment, identify this photo. We could confirm that they're able to do that.
I would love to see that happen. If there are any neurological researchers out there that, or AI researchers for that matter, who want to get access to about 100 professional caricature artists from around the world, call me. I'll set it up for you. But now, Scott McCloud, he's a comics researcher. He goes into some of this distillation, this complete boiling down of essence into something that the human brain can recognize as a thing, even though it doesn't look like the thing. He talks about this level of psychology. It's distilling down, but keeping the meaning. And so, yeah, I think these types of art producing AIs could really inform how we study perception and recognition. And like an arms race, I think they could push us. As somebody who's into the art form itself has definitely evolved. Each more extreme movement pushes for more exaggeration from the next crop of artists. And it's kind of exciting to see what AI might contribute to the world of caricature as a whole. Well, see, that's the artistic take on it. That's the pure artiste version of what I think of AI. In terms of the commerce of caricature, that's a whole different story. And once again, we have this segment of scam artists that are out there that are using some of this, or in some cases, passing AI off as something it's not. And first, though, I'll tell you, I did ask some of the ISCA people, the International Society of Caricature Artists. I threw it out on the forum and said, hey, what do you guys think of AI? And now, understand, the International Society of Caricature Artists, as I said, is not going to be a full representation of caricature artists around the world. The people in that group tend to be professionals who take the craft seriously. Most of them run successful enough businesses to at least pay the dues and belong to the organization. So they aren't really living hand to mouth. And generally, people who fear technology as it's going to steal our jobs are the people who are not running a successful business. If they're just surviving, then, I've seen caricature artists in the 90s that were terrified when the little booths came out with Photoshop where they could put your face on a muscle-bound body on top of, fitness magazine. They're like, oh, that's going to put us out of business. No, it's not. It's a different thing than we do.
Yeah, may have sliced off the clientele you didn't want to work with anyway. Who knows?
Absolutely. That's actually what many caricature artists raised. Now, first, when I posed the question, it started a vigorous debate about whether or not we should be rude and vulgar to Alexa to keep the robots in their place or whether we should be really polite just in case of a future robot uprising.
Yeah, there's an interesting debate there for sure.
Everybody was pretty split on that. Most of the caricature artists who responded feel pretty secure in their jobs, and they even see the AI that is out there, the slightly better than filters algorithms, or I'm not sure what the right word is, the programs that attempt to cartoonize a face. They see the development of those as kind of a positive thing for the industry because there will always be customers that want the lowest price possible, and they take your time up when they call you and they want their entire, family drawn, and they're like, what? You're going to charge more than $5 a face? That takes up time to explain to them, and they don't end up customers that you get paid by. They end up just problem people that you don't want to have to deal with. And an AI could take that whole demographic of customer away, or at least provide a stick you can throw that they can chase after. That's not taking up your time. Oh, your budget is only, $12. Well, here, check out this app. There you go. The AI option could also make hand-drawn work or digital work drawn by a human being kind of seen as more valuable. And it could free up artists for different creative directions. Much like the advent of photography did not kill the need for portrait painters, but it heralded sort of a broader array of ways that people represent likenesses. And it created the art form of collage. And, think of how many types of art use photography, but are driven by, of course, a human being orchestrated how that photography is put together. From gigantic collages using thousands of images to scrapbooking, So I sent you an example of something I did want to talk about in terms of AI and caricature. Yes, a decent AI that can draw passable caricatures would kind of be great to throw to the cheap, annoying customer demographic so we don't have to waste time justifying our prices. But judging from a lot of what I see, and I see a lot of caricature apps advertising themselves on my Facebook feed, or I see people regularly post them onto the ISCA forum, these apps are not great yet. Some of them are kind of cutesy. They're very, generic. I sent you an example of one. Are you looking at it?
I am, yeah. I mean, on one hand, it's impressive. This isn't something a computer could have done 5 years ago, but it's also meh.
Yeah, specifically the one, now you'll see a woman's face, and there are several different options that it gives you. And this is a friend of mine named Sarah. She went ahead and bought the app to try it out, and she posted her results for other caricature artists to see. The filter that's labeled caricature is actually the bottom row, second from the right. And that is the one that is, I think, the worst of the bunch in terms of her likeness. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I agree. Absolutely.
The resulting caricatured face does not look like it's the same race of the photograph. It changes the anatomy in a way that really harms the likeness. And so you can sort of tell what that's doing is it's just throwing a generic formula onto how the face is stretched. And that's the number one problem with AI and caricature. And the formula has to change for each face. You don't always make the nose big and shrink the chin. In some faces you do that. In other faces you blow up the, forehead and you shrink the chin. It's like a funhouse mirror that is specifically designed to each human face you encounter. So that if AI can figure that out, then it'll be a much better caricature artist. But for right now, it looks like they're throwing generic one-size-fits-all formulas into the mix, and that results in not fitting most of the human faces.
That's something that has impressed me quite a bit. If I were to frame this in the most machine learning-like way I can, I would say that caricature artists seem to have this skill of compressing an image into a couple of very, not even that many line segments, right? Caricature obviously can be elaborate, but I've seen some that are basic, yet still in a couple of strokes capture whatever that essence word is that I have to put in quotes because I don't know what it means. But that's sort of the magic of it that ML will try and do as well, but doesn't seem to do that in the same way a human does today.
There's a caricature joke that's very much formulated like an old engineer's joke. You heard the engineer's joke where he walks into a giant, huge machine room and he takes 2 seconds and he puts an X with a piece of chalk and says, "That's where your problem is. That'll be $10,000. And the owner of the factory machine goes, $10,000, but you just took 10 seconds and did an X. He's like, "Nope, you're not paying me for that time. You're paying me for all the time I, put into learning where to put the X." The caricature version of that is somebody hires a caricature artist to draw a celebrity, and he does it in 4 pen strokes, and it looks just like the celebrity. And he says, "That'll be $10,000. And he said, "Well, $10,000, you only did 4 pen strokes. If I could have done it in 3, it would be $30,000.
Really good one, yeah.
So now, again, with the aspect of AI kind of heralding in a new crop of ways people try to scam other people. As a caricature artist who knows a lot of other caricature artists around the world, and we all kind of talk to each other online, one thing that's been happening constantly is these AI, purportedly to be AI caricature apps that are popping up are advertising themselves using art produced by human caricature artists.
Oh, a real Mechanical Turk then, huh?
Yeah. Oh, very. Yes, I didn't think of that, but that is a very good comparison. And we know this because, much like I sent you the image of my friend Sarah with her face, we see, oh, there's an app. Wow, for $15, I can buy this app that will draw. There's my friend Scott. And there's the drawing that award-winning, Golden Nosy winner Ziding drew of Scott. So as a person who goes to the conventions, I recognize not only the model, but the caricature. It's like, no, that caricature was drawn digitally, but drawn by a human being who's been drawing caricatures for 30 years, who's been to art school, who has a lot of formal training. And the photo of the artist is somebody I know because it got drawn at the convention. And so the photographs of the award-winning caricatures and their models were published on the website for ISCA, and the bots or the scrapers or a human scammer has plucked them out and created a little ad indicating that award-winning drawing was drawn by a $15 app AI that you could buy. And that's just not the case. So I would definitely tell consumers to beware. If you buy the app, you're not going to get results like what you see advertised.
Can make a good screenshot for the website, but if the product doesn't match, that's also hard to police in an interesting way.
It's absolutely hard to police because these are often not based in America. And even if they were, it's very hard to, what are you going to do? Call the FBI and get them to track down the IP address? It's just one of those things. Just like artists are very much getting used to having their artwork lifted from their website and advertised by the random t-shirt sellers that are cropping up on Facebook every day. And they just regurgitate. You can throw comments in the comment section saying, hey, that's my artwork. You don't have a right to use it. And it gets deleted, or they become a different company the next day. And again, the caveat emptor I'll throw out there is if you're buying any sort of reproduction of artwork from Facebook or some random producer, the images that they're scraping off the internet are 72 DPI. And so you have an AI, you have a bot creating products with artwork that by necessity, because of the internet, because of the needs of streaming things online, is a very low quality. It's not print quality. So I know people who've bought these shirts and I was like, oh, you accidentally bought a shirt created by a bot and, shipped out. Everything's automatic. I don't even know if the human being is involved in any way, shape, or form except to get it started.
Well, they cashed the check, I'm sure.
Yeah, but you've just bought something that has ripped off somebody I know. That's their artwork. And here, if you'd like to get a version that doesn't suck, because 72 DPI blown up to the size of a t-shirt is incredibly low resolution and looks terrible. Here, spend an extra $5 and buy it from the artist's website. Here's their website. Go at it.
Good advice, yeah. This is an increasing problem. It's so easy to scrape things and, broadly speaking, so little enforcement of copyright infringement, especially for the long tail of content producers.
Really, I don't see a way to enforce it or scrape it. I mean, we can't lock down the internet. The cat's out of the bag. I think making consumers more educated about what you get if you get sucked into the bots and the AIs that are out there working on behalf of scammers. Education is, I think, the best tool.
And we've got to get educated on recognizing legitimate from fraudulent stuff or copyright infringing or whatever, because I can assure you the algorithms are going to continue to get better at producing fakes.
Absolutely.
Well, Celestia, first, where can people learn more about Squaring the Strange?
Well, just type in Squaring the Strange to any of the podcast dispensers, and you should find us. We also have a Facebook discussion group if you want to join up and see what we've got going on. We don't so much get into AI. If you're into the technological side, this might be just a way to rest your brain and hear about Sasquatch and bottomless holes and folklore and legends and, hauntings and con men. We do talk quite a bit about frauds and hoaxes and con men too, so...
There's always something fun going on. I'm a regular listener, so I'm glad we had a chance to catch up. For you yourself, where can people find you online?
I am working as a PR coordinator for half the time, but I do also keep up doing commissions and doing caricature work at twoheadsstudios.com. That's numeral 2 HEADSSTUDIOS.com.
Excellent. We'll have notes to all that in the show notes. Celestia, thank you so much for coming on to share your experiences and expertise.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Kyle.